afternoon everyone, it's Debbie Evans here, and Rolo's here at the moment, though I'm not sure how long he's going to stay. Today we're reading to you from book 5. It's The Secret Adventures of Rolo, Phoenix and the Dragonling, and the chapter we're going to read today is all about Titanic. Now, when I do primary school visits in ordinary times, children often ask me whether Rolo can visit Titanic and perhaps save the doomed ship. Well, I've done lots of research, and ahed about how Rolo can actually influence events of the day. Of course, he can't save the sinking ship, but perhaps he can play a part in the rescue. So I'm going to read to you Rolo and the Titanic, chapter 6. The floppy-haired boy has a fascination with the sinking of the Titanic. So do most school children, it seems. It's a favourite topic. Athelstan explained to me what is known about the most famous ship in the world's fatal maiden voyage. The ship was constructed in just over 2 years by around 3,000 men from Harland and Wolff, the Belfast-based shipbuilders, and financed by an American, J.P. Morgan, of the White Star Line. She cost around $7.5 million or £5.2 million and was registered in Liverpool. It was the largest passenger steamship ever built and was thought to be unsinkable by the engineers who built her because of the inclusion of 15 separate watertight hulls. Ironically, when she sank, the last visible part of the Titanic was the name Liverpool. I put my head on one side with a quizzical look. Why do you refer to a ship as she? Athelstan ignored me and continued, that meant if one or two of the compartments were damaged, incoming water would be contained and the ship would still float. That was the theory, the tree dragon explained. Who were the people on the ship? I asked. There were 3 classes of travel for passengers on board. The very wealthy had all the luxuries of first-class accommodation, complete with swimming pool, Turkish baths, gymnasium and fine dining. Passengers in second class had deck games and board games to play, and steerage had to make their own amusements and would not have been very comfortable in the bottom of the ship, closest to the hot and smelly engine room. The difference in the price of tickets ranged from £875 for first class down to £3. Those travelling in third class, known as steerage, were mainly families hoping for a new life in America. But the voyage was doomed, and the cold sea took no account of how much anyone had paid for their passage, although it has to be said the wealthier passengers had better access to the lifeboats. I shivered my terrier shake. Athelstan resumed his narrative, and I settled down at the foot of the tree to listen in fascination. The ship sailed from Southampton, bound for New York, on Wednesday, 10th of April 1912. There were 922 passengers at that point, and astonishingly a crew of 892. There were further stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, now known as Cove, in Ireland. The ship was only half full, and yet the lifeboats provided could have only coped with half that number of passengers, which may seem extraordinary now, but was within the maritime law of the time. The same law carried the instruction to save women and children first. Edward John Smith was the proud captain of the ship. During the short journey across the Atlantic, Captain Smith received several warnings of icebergs, but the ship continued to cruise at a very fast speed as the White Star Line prided herself on attempting the fastest journey time for an Atlantic crossing. By the time the fatal iceberg was sighted off Newfoundland, Canada, late at night on 14th of April, it was too late to change course, and the ship struck hard. The giant iceberg ripped holes in several sections of the hull. This was at 11:40 p.m, and within just 3 hours, the ship had sunk to the bottom of the seabed, some 2 miles down. Panic ensued, and the first lifeboats were launched with barely any passengers on them. 2 first-class passengers even managed to save their small dogs, namely a Pekingese called Sun Yat-sen, owned by the heir of a New York publishing company, and a Pomeranian called Lady. Surviving owners later stated that they didn't think their pets had taken up any extra space in the lifeboats, and amazingly these lucky dogs survived their ordeal, unlike many humans. Athelstan added and paused somberly. "Were there many lives lost?" I asked quietly. Over 1,500 passengers died in what was then the world's worst sea disaster, and only 715 survived, though they too have all passed away now, as it is more than 100 years since the disaster occurred. I shivered again. "Why did so many people die?" I asked. Panic set in. Lifeboats were dispatched from the sinking ship without being fully laden with passengers. Priority was given to those on the upper deck, which would have been first class. The poor souls who fell or jumped into the dark and freezing sea would have died instantly from the shock of the cold water, so it is some comfort to know that they would not have suffered, Athelstan added gently, sensing my distress. "Do you want to go and witness this for yourself?" the tree dragon asked me in all seriousness. I replied at once, "No, actually I didn't. Not if I couldn't change the outcome of events and avert disaster. My visit would have no purpose." Then I had an idea. Could the unicorns and dragons use their combined flying strength to keep the sinking ship afloat until rescue came? I answered hopefully. "I'm afraid not, little pup. There are some events we just cannot change. I am aware that there was a story circulated in the New York Times newspaper a few days after the disaster. It mentioned a large Newfoundland dog called Regal, who managed to save some lives that night because of his ability to survive in freezing water due to the thickness of his coat, and that afterwards, it's claimed, he was adopted by an officer from a rescue ship, but this is just a story made up to give people comfort after such a terrible tragedy." I went home with my tail between my legs, feeling very sad indeed about the Airedale Terriers, Spaniel, French Bulldog, Great Dane and Fox Terrier who hadn't survived, as well as those 1,500 human passengers. I snuggled against the smiley lady and floppy-haired boy extra closely when I next had the opportunity. A couple of nights later, I was awoken by Yulia with a summons from Athelstan. The tree dragon got straight to the point. "Actually, there is something you can do. On the 15th of April 1912, that would be the day after the Titanic struck the iceberg, as I recall." "But if I can't save the ship," I started to protest. "Trust me," said Athelstan in a voice that made me listen. And that is how I found myself on a ship in the middle of the freezing Atlantic via the time tunnel. My fear was that I was on board the fated Titanic, but I trusted Athelstan that this wasn't the case. Where was I then? I was in a cabin, and luckily the door was wedged open. I looked about in the corridor and then trotted up on deck. Not too many passengers about, neither passengers nor crew. Someone was coming. I jumped under a tarpaulin to hide and looked around at the stacked life jackets. I realised I was hiding in a lifeboat. I peered out when the deckhand had passed by and spotted a red and white lifebuoy ring imprinted with the name of the ship, Carpathia. I waited in the darkness of the covered boat to see what Athelstan had in store for me and how I could possibly help. Peering beneath the tarpaulin a few moments later, I witnessed a frantic conversation between a telegraph operator and the man I assumed to be the captain because of the gold braid on the shoulders of his uniform. Something about a distress signal which had come in from a ship that had struck an iceberg some 58 miles away. The captain was giving orders to change the ship's position at once to go to the aid of the stricken liner. There was a definite lurching and an increase of speed. I felt scared. When the coast was clear, I poked my head out again and saw a bearded officer listening to the captain. We are to change course at once to go to the aid of a ship in distress. It's not on our route from New York to Fiume, but we are the nearest vessel. This old girl has never travelled so fast, but time is of the essence if we're to pick up the Titanic's imperiled passengers. We need to get a top speed of 17 knots out of her. Beware of icebergs, sir, said the officer. I'm fully aware of the danger, Smethwick, but people's lives are at risk. With God's help and a wing and a prayer, we can get there in time to give whatever aid we can. I heard orders being given for hot food and drinks to be made ready, and the crew and passengers of the Carpathia busied themselves with fetching up warm clothing and blankets, whilst first aid stations were hastily assembled. 3 hours or so had passed since the radioed message from the stricken ship was received. No sign of her, declared the captain in despair as he put down his binoculars. He checked the coordinates again and confirmed that we had indeed reached the spot where the ship had struck the iceberg. I lifted the flap of the tarpaulin on the seaward side of the lifeboat and stared out at the dark sea. Glowing white lumps of ice bobbed menacingly in the water, adding to the eeriness, and all was deathly quiet. The crew were facing the other direction, scanning the horizon for any sign of life, when suddenly I saw a flare like a shooting star come out of the darkness and make an arc of light in the distance before disappearing. I barked and barked and barked, giving myself away at once, but I had to do something to make the crew aware of what I'd seen. Everyone turned to face my side of the ship, and I kept on barking, and thankfully at that moment another flare went up. Over there, the cry went up, and the ship was swiftly turned round. As we approached the spot, the captain ordered the engines to be shut down, and we floated towards the place where the lights had been seen. I spotted it first, a lifeboat bobbing on the sea with not many people in it. We got closer and I could see the anxious face of a small dog bundled in blankets, being tightly hugged by its terrified owners. Arms reached down from the bottom rung of the ship's ladder, tightly fitted against the side of the Carpathia, and the rescue operation began in earnest. Dazed passengers were lifted from the Titanic's drifting lifeboats and swaddled in blankets as soon as they were pulled on board the rescue vessel. They were sobbing and praying and talking in disbelief about what had just happened to the unsinkable ship. I barked again. I could see another lifeboat in the distance. Again the crew were alerted, and this was repeated many times over the next 5 hours. By the end of it, I'd nearly lost my voice. The recovery operation was in full swing and pretty slickly operated. No one rested until the last survivors had been plucked from the sea. Later on deck, I overheard the head count of the 705 people who had been rescued. The crew were elated and exhausted, and it was full steam ahead for New York, 3 days' travel away, where Carpathia and her captain and crew received a hero's welcome, and the Titanic survivors would have been very relieved indeed to set foot on dry land again. Amid the celebrations in port, I was rescued by Gwyn, and we managed to take to the skies unseen whilst everyone else was giving thanks for the survivors. I never did see a large Newfoundland fitting the description of regal, and I think it probably was just an urban myth, just as Athelstan had said. What happened to the rescue ship Carpathia? I asked Athelstan, once safely delivered by Gwyn. I'd only just noticed that the dragon had grown strong enough to carry me. She was commissioned as a troop ship in the First World War and was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland in 1918, just before the war ended, whilst transporting soldiers from Liverpool to Boston. Most of her passengers and crew were rescued by another ship, the Snowdrop, and thankfully there were not many casualties on that occasion. The rescuer was rescued, I thought to myself, not only thinking about the ship. So thank you very much for listening. We'll be back again tomorrow at 3:15 on Rolo's Facebook page, and afterwards these videos are posted onto my YouTube channel That's under my name, Debbie Evans. And we'll be back tomorrow afternoon. Bye for now.